Dear friends, I want to thank Francesco for organizing this conference. It's a good time to start assessing our situation now that we're 8 weeks into the pandemic shutdown. But as I am sure with most of you, we are still too engaged in the pandemic and its staggering loss of life to even conceive what an aftermath might look like. Projections are dire and rampant and varied, but we don't know. We don't know when our museums will reopen, we don't know when we will be allowed to have large gatherings, and we don't know when funding will return for conservation projects. We do know that we will face significant financial and social challenges in the future, but we don't know what form they will take. Unlike other economic downturns, this one was not instigated by economic triggers or cyclical fluctuations. However, the cost of responding is and will be enormous, much greater than any other crisis outside of a major war. In fact, in the US, we're approaching a federal cost equivalent to our participation in World War II. Although I will refrain from making political statements, we will face political challenges related to this enormous cost that will most certainly affect how we manage, protect, fund, and develop industrial heritage in the future. I'm sure many of you have seen images of outrage and inexplicable reaction to government public health orders. I think these will continue, and the sentiment they decree will influence the debate on how we pay for this response and what constitutes necessary government programs in the future. I think it will be a good idea to hold this conference again in December, when we have a better idea of where we're heading. Basically, right now, we're all closed. We don't know when we will reopen, but we're working on reopening plans even with deep uncertainties. I have been working with museums and public heritage sites and documentation protection and interpretation for most of my career. From this perspective, I see a 5-stage process for managing the pandemic in our sector. Stage 1 is the crisis and reaction, which includes immediate operational changes, reactions and adjustments, and initial stabilization, driven as a direct response to a public health crisis. This includes critical care management, business closures, and work-from-home orders. This is the stage we're in right now. Stage 2 is planning for reopening with short-term operational changes. While we in the US are easing into this phase, most of us don't know when we will reopen. We are still in the crisis stage and won't be able to fully plan for reopening until we know when we will reopen and what limitations and restrictions we will have. Stage 3 is reopening with a phased implementation and reaction, adjustment, and stabilization. When we do finally restart public engagements, we will phase them and include new restrictions on gatherings, access, cleaning, etc. Not all of our plans will work, meaning we will need to adjust and adapt before we come to a safe, workable short-term operation. Stage 4 is planning for the future and making long-term operational changes. As we get a better understanding of the full impacts and consequences of the pandemic, both social and economic, we can create a long-term plan and return to our missions. Stage 5 is stability, meaning ultimately we will come to a new operational standard. This will probably mean smaller budgets, smaller staff, less travel, and fewer visitors. In mid-May, the United States had the most confirmed cases of COVID-19 and the most infection-related deaths of any country. New York State alone has had 3 times more deaths than any other state and the highest number of confirmed cases than any other country outside of the U.S. However, considering population and population density, the U.S. has had a rate of infection comparable to most European countries. The U.S. is currently in various states of lockdown and social distancing. Most states have stay-at-home orders and require masks in public spaces, but some states have granted exceptions for religious services, gun purchases, and going to the beach. We are expecting some states to fully lift quarantines this month, but most will wait until June or even July. I've been working at home for the last 8 weeks. I'm the director of the Anthracite Heritage Museum, Scranton Iron Furnaces, and Eckley Miners Village, all in northeast Pennsylvania's anthracite coal region, which is about 2 hours west of New York City. We are funded and operated by the state government of Pennsylvania and are part of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, which operates 24 historic sites and museums across the state, including 7 on the Industrial History Trail. Most of our sites are still in stage 1, crisis response and management, but cautiously considering reopening plans without a full understanding of what will be permissible from a public health perspective and what will be possible from an economic perspective. Our state has implemented a red, yellow, green strategy for reopening. Counties in the red still show case numbers too high to let people out of lockdown and maintain steep restrictions on movement and businesses. Yellow will allow some easing of restrictions on outdoor spaces, but retain limitations on indoor spaces and public gathering sizes. Green will eliminate most restrictions on spaces, but will still require social distancing and smart public engagement, with likely limitations on crowd size for the foreseeable future. Many states have some sort of structured opening strategy, but some unfortunately do not. Our shutdown occurred just as our museums were about to reach the busiest 2 months of the year, when we get about 40% of our visitation through school tours. We have canceled all programs and events for at least 6 months, and we will reevaluate the rest of the year in July. The closure will have significant impacts on visitation overall. The spring and summer are usually the busiest times of the year, with groups, tourists, major fundraisers, and public events at their peak. Further, fears about the virus will impact some people's decisions on where they will go when things open up. While we're taking a hit on visitation, we've been trying to build a presence online with social media posts about mission-related topics and exhibits, and our curators are working to make more of our collection research materials available online. The impact on museums and historic sites in general has been, of course, dramatic. Broadly, all museums and historic sites in the country have closed, and most are working to provide online content. My colleagues at private nonprofit industrial museums in Pennsylvania, which are generally small and located in less populated areas, are mostly operating under these conditions, and most have had minimal layoffs so far. The National Museum of Industrial History has kept the museum active online by offering virtual lectures. The Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor, National Canal Museum, and Rivers of Steel have all been doing about the same with minimal layoffs. The state-owned PHMC Industrial Trails of History sites, which include my museums, the Pennsylvania Railroad Museum, the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum, Cornwall Iron Furnaces, and Drake Well, have retained professional staff working from home and maintenance staff working at the sites. Unfortunately, associate staff who primarily engage the public and offer museum membership services through affiliated nonprofit organizations have been laid off or have been considered for layoff. Large private American museums, however, with large budgets and costly urban areas, have had a much harder time. In New York City, the Museum of Modern Art is anticipating a $7 million loss, terminated all of its education and visitor services staff, and mandated permanent pay cuts for upper-level management. The Tenement Museum, also in New York City, which interprets migration to and living conditions in the United States from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries, reduced its staff by 113 and cut its operating costs by 70%. The Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, one of the earliest and largest industry and technology museums, laid off 1,400 people, or 80% of its staff, and the Science Museum of Minnesota laid off 450, or 85% of its staff. Other American industrial heritage organizations are in similar states of shutdown and wait. The U.S. Society for Industrial Archeology annual conference, scheduled for the end of May, was postponed for 1 year, as was the annual Mining History Association conference. The U.S. National Park Service industrial sites, including Steamtown, Hopewell Furnaces, Lowell, Klondike Gold, and Keweenaw, have all closed to the public and are working on reopening plans that reflect official national policy and individual state rules. All National Park Service industrial documentation projects have been canceled for the time being. The Historic American Engineering Record, the Historic American Building Survey, and the Historic American Landscape Survey, which usually have summer projects, are all on temporary shutdown. Most summer archaeological field schools and many internships are also canceled for the year. The state historic preservation offices, which operate at the state level but are funded by the federal government, are still functioning, but mostly remotely. The SHPOs have obligations under Federal National Historic Preservation Act to review projects that include federal funding, permits, or licensing, and ensure that potential impacts to cultural resources are mitigated. These offices will still review projects and require documentation or mitigation as necessary when construction projects resume. Further, all tourist attractions have been closed for the time. The Anthracite coal region of Pennsylvania has 3 tourist mines, and all are closed indefinitely. United States industrial heritage sites and programs are all either in stage 1 or stage 2 of the reaction to the pandemic. Before we move to the next stage, we will need to answer the biggest unknowns. What exactly will be the level and form of future funding, and how will intangible social impacts affect visitation? Funding for museum, conservation, research, and documentation come from 3 primary sources, and each will see significant changes. They include public money from governments through direct appropriations or grants, private money from foundations, donations, sponsorships, and contributions, and from earned income, which results from visitation, admissions, and store sales. The U.S. government has so far funded its response to the coronavirus crisis with a 50% increase to its annual budget and a 3-fold increase to its annual debt costs. The U.S. government is projected to spend $2.4 trillion on COVID-19, with a potential $3 trillion more proposed. In 2019, our total U.S. budget was $4.4 trillion, with nearly $1 trillion of that borrowed. In the near future, there will be significantly less money available for heritage. This is coupled with the current job loss of 32 million people and the reduction in tax revenue and increase in social assistance costs. As part of the $2.4 trillion response, the U.S. government passed the CARES Act, which is to provide an immediate cash infusion to every citizen while providing forgivable loans to small businesses. While museums and nonprofits are included in this program, the Act also provides emergency funding to the National Endowment for Humanities and the Institute for Museum and Library Service to award grants to museums, libraries and archives, historic sites, and other cultural organizations across the country to help these entities continue to advance their mission. As much as this financial boost is needed right now, the cost of this boost will be spread out over the next few years and will impact other future funding priorities. In my state of Pennsylvania, our 2019 budget was $32 billion. It is estimated that the cost of the crisis at the state level will be several billion dollars. The state covers the operational costs of all state historic sites, including mine, and provides an additional $2 million in direct grants to private, municipal, and county historical sites and museums. In addition to the unanticipated drop in revenue in the fourth quarter of the fiscal year, losses in future tax revenue and increases in social assistance will definitely impact future operations. Private sector contributions are likewise impacted by the loss of revenue from both direct and earned income and from investments. These revenue sources are expected to decline in the near term because of reductions in stock values, corporate revenue, and personal income. The second factor affecting near-term and future stability is the likelihood of visitors returning to cultural institutions, impacting revenue contributions to earned income. Some portion of the population will not have the immediate financial resources to consider visiting museums for some period of time. However, recent studies have shown that among financially able patrons, there is a strong desire to start visiting sites within the next 3 to 6 months. These expectations, however, do not apply equally to all institutions. Not surprisingly, patrons tend to expect to return to the types of places that offer space, a relative freedom of movement, and an element of virus security faster than to confined, crowded spaces or interactive exhibits. Historical sites, botanical gardens, and zoos, for instance, rate highly for a faster return, while museums, performing arts venues, and movie theaters rate low due to the coronavirus pandemic. For public institutions, there is currently a general ethos to keep staff employed through the crisis to support some, even marginal economic activity. However, those governments overall are facing significant tax revenue shortfalls for the period and anticipate further long-term drops due to the number of people who now face unemployment and will contribute less future tax revenue. Further, governments are spending significant sums of money on immediate public assistance and medical response and will need to fund readiness for future crises, which will also impact pending budgets. The big question about returning to some sense of future stability will revolve around revenue and visitation. How soon will funders be able to assist cultural institutions, and how soon will visitors feel financially comfortable and safe to return to museums and large public spaces is still an unknown. Thank you.